This
I'm Jared
conference
Deal.
will now be recorded.
There we go. I'd like to welcome you to here today and thank John Summers for offering to do a presentation for our members. It's just a quick bit of background. John Summers is Nova Scotia's executive lead on the Coastal Protection Act and has worked in the provincial government for more than 30 years in a number of roles across departments. These include Economic, Rural Development and Tourism, the Office of Policy Planning, the Department of Labour and Advanced Education, prior to his current role with Nova Scotia Environment. We'll have a quick Q&A at the end for discussion. We're not expecting we'll probably be here for the full hour. It's about a 15 to 20 minute presentation. Feel free to type any questions that kind of pop in to the chat bar on the side and hit enter at the end if they weren't addressed. And I can read them out for John at the end. We can kind of get into those. I think we'll have a bit of time as well. There's some questions that John wants to ask all of you that we can have a bit of a discussion on for these regulations moving forward. So without further ado, thank you so much, John, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jared. I know you can see my screen there. I'll just go out to presentation mode, and I don't know if that means you folks will disappear, but you can let me know if that is working. Yep, there, you can see. Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for this opportunity. As you'll figure out pretty quickly, if you're not already aware, the Coastal Protection Act, I think, is of definite interest to planners. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to share what we're working on with you and hear your thoughts. Just a quick outline of what we'll be talking about today, a little introduction to the Coastal Protection Act. If some of you work for municipalities, you may have be familiar with some of the material I'm going to be talking about today. We'll cover how the CPA will work, what it does to protect coastal ecosystems, and then focus in on the areas that I think will be most interesting to planners, about two kinds of setbacks that are sort of primary regulatory tools for protecting a sea level rise and coastal erosion. So those are minimum building elevations and site-specific horizontal building setbacks. We'll talk a little bit about who we think needs to know about the CPA, and then we'll look forward to discussion. So I'll probably go pretty quickly here. This usually takes about 15 or 20 minutes to burn through. I'll try to get it through in 15, and then that'll give us lots of time to circle back if we need to. So a good place to start maybe is with any legislation, it's always healthy to ask, what problem are we trying to fix? So in Nova Scotia, of course, our coastline is very vulnerable to sea level rise. We've got a lot of low-lying areas, and so those are already feeling the effects of sea level rise and storm surge. We expect that to get worse over the coming decades. There are also a lot of areas that are particularly prone to erosion on a national scale. Nova Scotia has some of the worst erosion problems in the country, and the stabilization measures we undertake to try to control those can actually accelerate erosion in some cases. And once you get into that game, it's an expensive long-term battle. And just before I joined this call, I was hurriedly typing out a response to a councillor from Cape Breton who has a constituent who's wondering if there's any financial assistance available for people who are trying to keep erosion at bay at on their property, and there isn't. So that's another reason to try and stay out of nature's way. And finally, those structures that we use to try to control erosion, they interfere by definition with the natural dynamic nature of the coast, and that can impact coastal ecosystems that are, of course, very important to us. So the government passed the Coastal Protection Act in 2019. It had support from all political parties, and the stated purpose of the act is to prevent development of related activities in areas where it'll damage sensitive coastal ecosystems, or where the property or the construction will be at risk from inundations, so coastal flooding, storm surge, sea level rise, or coastal erosion. So we're currently working on regulations Those regulations have to be ready before the act can be proclaimed into law. The act is very much a framework, and so it's the what, and the regulations are very much the how. Government has committed to public consultation to further inform the development of those regulations, and we're hopeful that will start fairly soon. And yeah, so the CPA is kind of a unique shape in some ways. So what challenges shaped the way we developed that act? Well, the first thing is we've got over 13,000 kilometers of convoluted coastline, and the geography, the geology, topography, bathymetry, tidal ranges, and wave exposure is all different around the coast. So we can have areas that are very prone to erosion, within a few tens of meters of harder rock outcrops that are not going anywhere and are pretty much impervious to erosion. We're trying to keep incremental regulatory and administrative burden to a minimum. This is particularly important for municipalities. The CPA, as you'll see, works through other legislation, so we're not saying there won't be any incremental administrative burden, but we are working to keep it to an absolute minimum. This is Nova Scotia. We've got a lot of communities with already developed waterfront areas, so we recognize we'll probably need some modified rules for those areas so that we're not, so we're being respectful of what's frequently the economic engine for a lot of smaller coastal communities. And this probably, if there's an understatement in this presentation, this would be it. There are a lot of different stakeholders with diverse short and long-term interests. So if you are a planner, you might look at it differently from a development officer. You might, and a real estate agent might look at it differently than an insurance agent might. So there are a lot of, a whole mixture of interests around coastal development. So how will the act work? So the first thing is the regulations will create a coastal protection zone. So this is like a thin band around the coast within which the act and the regulations apply. We don't know how wide that band is going to be yet, so we're working on that. But it's not a setback in itself. It's an administrative trigger for where the other setbacks apply. The primary regulatory tools here will be a shoreline structures standard or restrictions to protect coastal ecosystems. That'll work through Crown Lands Act permits, and it'll apply to areas below the ordinary high water mark on submerged Crown land. And then the other two are really aimed at where we're building houses and buildings to avoid building in areas that we know just doesn't make sense. So we'll have vertical setbacks, which we will call minimum building elevations to reduce the risk of inundation, and then a system of site-specific horizontal building setbacks. And so this is where, when I say the upland boundary of the coastal protection zone is not a setback in itself, it's kind of a container in which a setback will be determined, and it'll be a designated professional. So not unlike an on-site qualified person or a site professional for a contaminated site. So it'll be an independent third party who comes and determines what the erosion risk is and what the setback needs to be. More on that in a few slides. So the CPA doesn't create any new permitting processes. As I said, it works through processes that already exist. It doesn't require any legally permitted existing structures to be moved, and it allows for normal maintenance and repair. It does apply when you're going to expand an existing structure, unless it's exempt for some other reason. And the Act and regulations will allow for reasonable exemptions. So there are lots of different structures like fish plants, piers, and things like that, that for functional reasons need to be located directly in contact with the water. So how it will work, basically along the ordinary high water mark, this is where Crown Lands Act and Beaches Act permits are normally required for doing things like shoreline armoring, building wharves and boat slips and things like that. We're not going to stop people from building wharves and boat slips, but based on guidelines that are already in place through Lands and Forestry, we'll elevate those into the area of regulation so that we're able to enforce that more consistently. And really that part of the regulations is around the design and the materials that are going in the water. So no pressure treated lumber in the water, clean fill going in between the crib work, open crib work to minimize the disruption of the longshore sediment flow and things of that nature. Excuse me. So on the upland side, these are where the 2 setbacks apply. And for a municipality, these 2 conditions need to be met for you to be able to, for a municipality to be able to issue a development permit or a building permit for construction in these areas. So you'll need to be above this minimum building elevation. More on that in a moment. That'll be different for different areas of the province because we're basing it off of mean sea level or a proxy for that. And so we have to adjust for tides and things of that nature. And if you want to build between that area and the upland boundary of the coastal protection zone, that's where you'll need this erosion assessment from a designated professional. So just a quick word on how we're going to delineate the coastal protection zone. You can think of it as an offset from the ordinary high water mark. It's really easy to do that when you've got a nice straight piece of shoreline. There aren't too many of those in Nova Scotia. So part of the puzzle that we're working on, in addition to how far upland should that coastal protection zone boundary, how far in it should be, there are also lots of other great challenges, like how do you delineate around complex shoreline shapes like estuaries? How far up rivers do we go? Some estuaries in Nova Scotia go way, way inland, I think beyond where we could sell to landowners that they are on the coast. So we do plan to have a cutoff fairly near ocean waters. How do we deal with barrier beaches? You can see that the upper picture there, just how complex that type of shoreline can be. That's on the eastern shore somewhere. And make sure that we're covering off coastal wetlands and marshes. They're very important as well. We're also working on solutions to address already developed downtown waterfronts. So we don't want to open a barn door so that more and more infrastructure gets placed right on the water that doesn't need to be, but we also recognize that lots of communities in Nova Scotia already have these downtown waterfronts that are very important to their community identity and economy. And an underlying current here always is how do we leverage digital mapping solutions to make sure that regulation is as simple as possible and people can see where those boundaries are. I mentioned shoreline structure standard. I can come back to this. I don't want to spend too much time on it because I want to get to the setbacks, but basically we're really focusing in on things like preventing toxic building materials from being in the water, minimizing the interference to the natural dynamic nature of the coast. I think the most significant thing for a lot of people will be new rules around shoreline armoring. So we want to prevent that for undeveloped property, and we don't want to have the entire shoreline armored. It creates all sorts of Nova Scotia. It creates lots of problems. But where an existing structure is threatened by erosion or there's already shoreline armoring in place, then we think there will be allowances for maintaining or installing armoring where we're protecting existing property. If it's a big open field and there's no development there, other aspects of the act are encouraging people to move back far enough from the shoreline, and that's where we would not issue a permit for infilling and shoreline armoring. So on to the setbacks. So the minimum building elevation, it's simplistically, it's the main defense against sea level rise and storm surge. We know from previous public consultation that Nova Scotians expect vertical setbacks in the regulations. We call them minimum building elevations, but it'll be not different really from a number of areas in Nova Scotia that already have vertical setbacks. For instance, downtown HRM, I think it's 3.8 meters above mean sea level or above CGVD 28, I think it is. And so that'll be expressed as a vertical distance above mean sea level. We'll probably use CGVD 2013 as the datum. And because it covers the entire coastline, we need to come up with a system of different setbacks for various areas around the coast. So in Nova Scotia, as I'm sure everyone's aware, particularly in the upper Bay of Fundy, this is where you have these hypertidal regions. So 3.8 meters above mean sea level might be great for Halifax. If you do that in Burnt Coat Head, you're going to be under cold salt water twice a day, every day. So that's why we have to adjust for tides. And so we've created a system of coastal segments. I think there are 82 of them, based on 20 centimeter break points in the tidal amplitude. And so they're most numerous and shortest around the Minas Basin, Cobequid Bay, Upper Bay of Fundy area, and then they get spaced out there longer and farther between. I'm kind of jumping around here a bit, but basically it's key for us to understand the risk. So we're looking what goes into that minimum building elevation. Well, we're starting with mean sea level in a base year, and we're going to add these adjustments for local tides. We haven't selected exactly what projection for sea level rise we're using, but everyone on this call, if you're at all involved with flood mapping, you're probably aware of the latest estimates from NRCan for relative sea level. So that incorporates vertical land motion as well. And there are lots of areas in Nova Scotia where it is estimated to be over a meter by the end of this century. And then we want to add an allowance for weather-related effects or storm surge. So we don't have the capacity or the scope really to estimate that possibility for every part of the province. So we will probably pick a single generalized constant. Once we've settled on those parameters, it's pretty easy for us to put those together into a regulatory schedule, which will look like a table with start and end points for the various segments. But we'll also produce a map, and our idea is to produce contours within each of those segments representing the minimum building elevation to make it as easy as possible for municipalities and landowners to figure out whether where they want to build is actually upland of that minimum building elevation. So we think we're hopeful that we'll make that as easy as possible. Okay, on to horizontal setbacks. So it's a mouthful, but we're calling these the site-specific horizontal building setbacks. And of course, one of the big challenges that we have in Nova Scotia is this very diverse set of conditions that are relevant to coastal erosion, sometimes within the same property or within a few tens of meters. So in our judgment, it didn't make sense to create big swaths of coastline with a common setback, because even in the areas that we think of as being fairly impervious to erosion, right next door, there are areas that are highly susceptible to erosion. So that's why we thought we would use the coastal protection zone boundary as a trigger, a regulatory trigger, and then the landowner needs to hire a designated professional who comes and, using a very specific methodology or an analytical tool that we're providing, that's referenced in the regulations. They have to use that tool and certify a setback for that particular property. So who's the designated professional going to be? Well, it'll be a member of a professional body, a self-regulating professional body that is designated in the regulations. The professional groups that we think would be suitably qualified to do this would be professional engineers, who, for those who this type of work would be in their scope of practice, geoscientists or geologists, professional geologists, and finally professional land surveyors. So as you'll see, a lot of this is about angles and distances. So we also think surveyors would be capable of doing this. And we're in conversations now, have been for some months, with all of those professional bodies. This erosion risk assessment, you could think of it like a survey or an on-site QP, that sort of thing. It's done at the landowner's expense. And that DP report needs to accompany a building permit application for construction in the coastal protection zone. So when a municipality is looking at a building permit application, first of all, they got to figure out whether the proposed location is within the coastal protection zone. So most municipalities, not all at the moment, but as planning people sort of up their game to meet minimum planning standards, all municipalities will need to kind of request at least a plot plan for new construction, or in some cases they may require a location certificate from a licensed surveyor, so that they can look at their map, compare to the diagram, figure out whether that location is within the coastal protection zone. Some types of structures are exempted, so we don't have that exactly nailed down, but an example would be like if it's a fish plant or something like that, it's obviously going to be exempted. So, if the assuming the Act actually applies to the type of construction they're looking at, and the location is proposed to be within the coastal protection zone, then the municipality needs to determine whether it's above the minimum building elevation. If it isn't, they can't issue a building permit, and that proposed location is upland of that site-specific setback that the DP determined. So what's this erosion test all about? We hired CBCL, most of you would know, is a firm with coastal engineering expertise here in Halifax. And they developed a tool for us, and the tool takes the form of a spreadsheet. And we've been asked many times, well, how can one type of assessment cover every situation in Nova Scotia? Well, this tool covers the vast majority of them. So we think it's pretty much universally applicable. It basically works by assessing categories of erosion risk and combining them in various combinations to figure out what the setback is. What the DP has to do is they have to visit the site. They have to do a bunch of measurements, angles, distances, and slopes. So they have to know the foreshore slope, the backshore slope and width, the angle and distance from the toe of a bluff to the crest of it. And in some cases that comes in 2 stages. And they have to test the geology to test the hardness of materials. We don't need to know what the actual substance is. We just care about how hard it is. Can it be pulled apart with your hands? Or do you have to whack it with a geology hammer, or can you scrape it with a knife, that sort of thing. They'll look for what is the cover on the beach. Is it big, heavy cobble? Is it fine sand? Is it gravel? Is it somewhere in between? Is it vegetated? On the bluff, are there signs of water seepage through them, things of that nature. They enter all these parameters into a spreadsheet. There are very prescriptive guidelines around how you interpret what you see. And this ensures some consistency in how the DP is, what they're observing and how they're interpreting it. And then the decision rules in the model do their job and determine the setback. So the basic underlying assumption here is that the shoreline wants to remain, or is always trying to get to some type of equilibrium. And so the foreshore angle is going to remain the same. That backshore wants to remain the same width, and the angle of the bluff is going to be trying to reach some sort of stable angle of repose, and that depends on what the material is. And so it's trying to maintain that kind of equilibrium, and what's pushing it out of equilibrium is wave action, erodibility, and sea level rise. So that's basically how that works. Just to wrap up here before we go to questions and discussion. So the Coastal Protection Act is not a long act, but it's complicated because it interacts with other legislation and other permitting regimes. So we know a lot of people will need to be aware of the act. So our approach to building a communications plan when we're getting ready to implement and train people up for this is to think about who would need to know and what are the sort of nodes when they would need to know it. So this is just sort of a quick list. We probably can add more detail to this, but we know this will first and foremost be of keen interest to land and building owners, developers, planners, whether they work for a municipality or they're independent planners or working for a consulting company. Builders, contractors, architects, engineers who are called in to advise landowners on construction. The designated professionals that are going to get designated, and some other types of installers and QPs as well. For instance, on-site installers and QPs will need to know about this. It'd be pretty smart for them to advise a landowner that they you know, there's not much point in building a septic system on site if you're not going to be able to build a house there. Land surveyors who may be DPs as well, but they also may have an interest. They may be called in occasionally to resolve a dispute about whether something's in the zone or not, or what the elevation is. Realtors, real estate appraisers, lenders, insurers, lawyers, and of course, municipal officials and provincial officials. So that's our last slide, and so I'd be happy to open it up to some conversation, and I'll just get out of presentation mode here in case we want to jump around, and be happy to take some questions.
Okay, we've got our first question from Norval. I'm surprised that there's no mention of Indigenous input. This is an act that will continue to be mired mostly in technical requirements that keep regulations from coming forward.
Could you, just not quite sure I got all that. Can you just read that again?
Yeah. So
I don't know if I have chat
I guess
There's
there's a couple questions actually in here. I'll go ahead, Norval.
So first, I can't believe that you didn't mention Indigenous input. I truly am surprised given the time this has been moving forward. And it seems this is the second part is this seems to be following New Brunswick's approach in that this ends up getting mired in technical detail and it never actually moves forward. So that's my two questions.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the first one. So Indigenous input will come in consultation. So we're anticipating consultation will come soon, but we're not in a position to announce consultation. So you can certainly rest assured that we won't, you know, we'll be doing everything we can to do that.
Okay, John, before you go on, just let me point out that you really should change that slide about consultation, like communications map, and they're not even there. I'm just saying, if I was you, I would add them. That's it.
Oh, appreciate that. It's not really a consultation map. It's about implementation when we go to implement the act, but good point. And I can assure you that our consultation plans certainly include consultation with Indigenous people. We did that when we consulted to inform the development of the act. And we've had a few conversations since then, but I can assure you that that's absolutely on our game plan. And sorry, your second point was, okay, is this following New Brunswick's?
Yeah, just that it's very technical. It's all, I mean, I understand it's a technical thing. But,
yeah, well,
you're going to have to define regulations and then change them as problems arise. So.
Well, I think that's the nature of regulation. So, I mean, the option is to declare, setbacks based on the worst case erosion scenarios throughout Nova Scotia, and that means we're probably over-regulating everywhere. So, it's not that we've done about, I think we did 27 tests of the tool. The technical detail is the business of the designated professional. I mentioned earlier that we will we're trying to keep administrative burden to an absolute minimum. So for a municipality, that really means making sure that they have the documentation from the in the designated professional report, the DP report, and that it's been signed off by someone who's a member in good standing of those professions. So it's really not much different from getting a survey done or hiring an on-site QP. So, I think that's kind of, we think the diverse nature of the coastline warrants this kind of approach.
Yeah, thanks from Norval on those. Question from Anna. Will landowners be able to apply for compensation if their land turns out to be undevelopable after the regulations are in place?
No, they won't. And if I just kind of mentioned at the start, I was just writing an email explaining to someone that there isn't funding available to protect against erosion from, at least from the public purse. So providing compensation is not part of it. So it's really no different than setbacks that are already in place in some parts of Nova Scotia already. So no, I think that's not on the table.
Okay, question from Paul Deck. Can you tell us more about the planned exceptions for existing downtowns and waterfronts?
Sure. So we've had a few conversations with municipal directors of planning through our colleagues at Municipal Affairs, but the general idea is to define an area based on some criteria where it's an already developed area, and have modified rules for those areas for certain types of structures. So if someone wants to build an individual private house in one of those areas, then absolutely both setbacks would apply. But for mixed use public amenities that are already in place in that general area, the idea is that we'd probably put something in place like perhaps only the minimum building elevation applies for living space. So that's the approach we're proposing there. And of course, that's an area that we'll be very interested to hear what planners have to say about.
Lovely. Question from Ian Watson. Is there a timeline for implementation? In particular, I think, is what is the expectation for municipalities who have already implemented similar regulations?
Okay, so two sort of questions in there, I guess. So first of all, timeline, I don't get to make that call, but we know the very next step is consultation, and we're hopeful that that'll happen soon. I can't be any more specific than that. But I can tell you that we have a lot, even with consultation, we still have a lot more work. So it's not like this is coming into effect this summer or anything like that. We have a lot more work to do before we're ready to implement. So for instance, we'll want to have training in place for municipal officials and designated professions, and even government people that will need to change the way they're doing a few things like issuing Crown lands permits. So that's about as specific as I can be at this point. And maybe you could just repeat the second part of that question.
Yep. Yeah, of course. What is the expectation for municipalities who've already implemented similar regulations? I think it's more like with regards to timing of when they'll need to kind of put these into place.
Yeah, so the act will basically have the effect of establishing a minimum. These setbacks will be minimum. So if a municipality has, for instance, a vertical setback that's greater than the minimum building elevation for that area, then in that regard, no change. The DPs will still need to do their thing on the horizontal setback. If a municipality has a vertical setback that's less than the minimum building elevation, then the minimum building elevation under the CPA is what will apply, and the municipality will need to figure out, do they need to change their land use bylaw or whatever to adapt to that, or how are they going to do that? It will not, just a point that came up the other day in a conversation, it will not replace those those vertical setbacks or flood mapping zones for municipalities. We'd expect those to follow whatever contour line they need to sort of follow. So it doesn't outright replace those, except for in the coastal protection zone, the minimum building elevation is what will apply.
Yeah, maybe I'll just have a follow-up just to clarify my understanding of that. So it's really when the regulations come into place, municipalities will have to kind of enforce them regardless of how the land use bylaws may or may not be updated like concurrently with these requirements. So it's really going to inform what the development permit requirements are. But for clarity's sake, we'll likely be taking a look at a lot of our land use bylaws.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And on the compliance side and the enforcement side, we don't see this any different for a municipality from what they're already doing. Every municipality issues building permits, some issue development permits, in some cases it's combined. But it's basically still in their bailiwick to ensure compliance, so to make sure that people built where they actually said they were going to build and that sort of thing. So we don't really see a change there, except there are these, for some municipalities that don't have any setbacks, there will be these new rules. Arguably, those would probably come anyway with minimum building standards. So like I say, we're trying to keep it to a minimum.
Question from Heather Archibald. What department will we send people to when they have questions? So will Nova Scotia Environment be heading this?
Well, I guess it depends on what kind of questions. If it's questions about the intent of the act or how it works, I'm sure we'll answer our fair share of those. But what we're going to do, I mean, the sharp end here really is where for inland of the ordinary high water mark is the municipal building officials. So we will do everything we can to support them and how it works. You know, I think we'll do a lot of public education around this as well, so people understand the general idea of how the act might affect what they're planning to do. And yes, we'll be there for municipalities to help them interpret. And I think that'll be a bigger demand in the earlier stages of implementation than you know, after things start to kind of level out and we all get used to this new regulatory regime.
I think that's it for the moment. So anybody, I'll give people a couple of moments if there's anything else. Do you have some questions, John, that you wanted to kind of ask us?
We do actually. So Mr. O'Leary, I think, is on the call, and maybe I'll ask him to speak up if that's okay. And we had a couple questions that we thought might be helpful for us in figuring out how to basically help out municipalities and what sort of supports we can apply here. So let me just.
Yeah, hey, John.
Great. There he is.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity, John, for allowing me to ask these questions. And Oh, I see Karen just asked a question there.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Do you mind if I?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, you go ahead on it.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot. So yeah, so hi everyone. I am a Master of Planning student at DAL, and I am doing my work term with Department of Municipal Affairs as well as with Dr. Eric Rappaport. And so myself and Daniel Bryce at Municipal Affairs, we are working on a guide to help municipalities kind of think about the Coastal Protection Act and what to do with coastal land use bylaws and how to go forward. So we just have a couple questions to ask, and I don't know how we can kind of get people's answers. So I don't know if people might want to write it in the chat or speak up potentially, but essentially the first question we have is, as planners, what information could be provided in a guidance document to help you align your municipal planning strategies with the Coastal Protection Act? And then the second question we have is, what information would you require when discussing with council the impacts of the Coastal Protection Act on municipal land use planning? So would it help if I write these in the chat? Or I don't know, Daniel, if you have any thoughts, or John, or Jared.
Yeah, that might be a good idea. And yeah, so we'd be interested in hearing anyone's thoughts on those kinds of questions. As I mentioned, we will, especially in the early stages of implementation, I think it'll be important for us to work really hard with municipalities to make it as easy as possible, understand what they need to do to be compliant with the Act and how to interpret it. So any thoughts you have on things we can do in particular to inform those efforts, that'd be great. And if they don't spring to mind right now, I think Jared is. I think if you haven't shared the PDF with everyone, I'm sure you will. But you can also send your thoughts to me on those things after the presentation. My contact information is on the final slide there.
Karen's got a question. Actually, I think that ties in quite well to this one. What happens if municipalities choose not to amend their land use bylaw to incorporate the provincial regulations?
I think that's up to the municipality. I think what the province will be expecting, well, what the law will require municipalities is that they're compliant with the Act. So I think it's up to the municipalities to figure out basically whether they need to amend their law or whether this one just layers over top of that as a minimum requirement.
Leah Perrin's got a question. Will your public engagement communication strategy include talking to residents about potential risks of building on the coast? I think that's actually a question that would tie into the guidance document piece, like just to know what engagement consultations coming out that kind of the province is leading versus what individual municipalities may need to run.
Right. So I think to be effective as a part of any consultation, we'll need to explain to people what the rationale is for creating a Coastal Protection Act in the first place. Hopefully that won't be too big a stretch for people to wrap their heads around, but that is sort of part of the consultation process, and that does not preclude other public awareness work that we could do well beyond consultation and when we're actually kind of in the final stretch before implementing the regulations.
Okay, so we've got these questions from James here. What information could be provided in a guidance document to help you align your municipal planning strategies with the Coastal Protection Act? I think actually what would probably help a lot of people would be actually guidance for land use bylaws for these. Like, so we all share concept definitions. I don't know if any other planners have thoughts on that, but that's kind of my initial.
It's Gordon Smith here with Department of Municipal Affairs as well, and I think part of an interesting question on this is the Coastal Protection Act is going to apply in a band around the province. right? And I think what we want to do too is think about what happens beyond that band, because there may be situations where the impacts that the Coastal Protection Act's dealing with extend beyond that zone, right? Like there might be you know, they're going to set a minimum building elevation, and you might have a spot that's beyond that zone that's still below that minimum building elevation. And I think just we as planners probably want to think about that a little bit, right? So that's some of what we're trying to think about, as well as not just what happens in the zone, but what happens beyond the zone, right? And again, I think these questions, if people want to have a look at them, or we can send them out. I see Sarah Poirier put a message in there. Maybe what we can do is send out these questions to the LPANS listserv. And if people want to reply, they can either, I just suggest they could reply directly to us through that. Or there could be a bit of a conversation go on the listserv there that would be helpful to us as we just kind of think about, is there some guidance that would be helpful?
Just to follow up on Gordon's point about this being a band around the coast, and you know, we gave careful consideration to, should we just base it on a minimum elevation and follow it everywhere, wherever those contour lines go? And I think at that point we decided not to do that. I mean, we're not trying, the Coastal Protection Act won't solve every flooding problem, and that's already being addressed through other means and other mechanisms. So so it will be, you know, the case where the Coastal Protection Act says, you know, your entire property is too low to the sea level to build on, and just on the other side of that line, if there's no other restriction, that someone could build. So like I say, it won't solve every problem, and it's important the municipalities address those problems as well, outside of the, obviously outside of the coastal protection zone.
I think James, other people might have ideas for that. Like second point you have, what information would you require when discussing with council the impacts of the Coastal Protection Act on municipal land use planning? I think you could almost do like a Q&A or like a guide for counselors on what this actually means, that like can help guide the conversation for planners with their councils.
Oh my God.
Oh, sorry, what was that, Norval?
Nothing, sorry. I should have been muted.
Are there any other questions,
thoughts, folks? Yeah. I think people might need some time to think about it.
Yeah, no, definitely. Kind of like what Sarah, if anyone wants to email me with some of those replies, feel free. But maybe kind of like what Gordon said, we can reach out by email sometime in the future.
I think I just saw a question in the chat there, but I didn't catch it. Is it?
Yeah. Just someone came late. There's looking about how the delineation of the inland limits of the coastal protection zone would take place. Is it just based on, I think it's supposed to be, it says ecotones, but I think it's supposed to be ecozones or just elevations. Is there anything in the act aimed at protecting the riparian zone?
The great question. So delineation is basically going to be distance based from the ordinary high water mark. So it's not actually based on elevations. The minimum building elevations will apply within that zone, but it's sort of an the coastal protection zone will be, we talk about when we're working on these delineation rules, like how will we snap the coastal protection zone upland boundary to the coast. Well, basically we'll use the ordinary high water mark or the high water mark as our reference line and have an inland offset from that. So we basically refer to that as the default delineation rule. And then we have, we're developing other rules for features such as estuaries. So the challenge we have there is, so we think what we'll do is we'll have a consistent but relatively arbitrary cutoff for how far inland we're actually going to reach. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that some rivers are, some estuaries reach so far inland, like tens and tens of kilometers. If you think about the Shubenacadie River or the Stewiacke River, one of them goes like right in past Lance, and it's still at a pretty low elevation. And I think we just feel that at some point we need to cut it off and say, okay, that is a job for some other administrative tool. So we've looked at various potential rules for where we cut off estuaries, and we've looked at, okay, can we base it on vegetation? Can we base it on salinization? Can we base it on tidal influence? And all those, or even federal provincial jurisdiction, or things like that. And almost every one of those rules has a fatal flaw in terms of our ability to consistently draw a line in a defensible spot. So basically we said, you know what, we're going to base it on distance. And it's either going to be on the minimum width of smaller rivers once they get down to a minimum width, or for the larger estuaries, like think about like the LaHave or Medway or rivers like that, there'll be a cutoff from the mouth of the river, like a certain distance inland. Not sure what that's going to be. A lot of those, or some of those major estuaries have reasonably large towns on them as well that will presumably either have or be doing their own floodline mapping and zoning. So that's the approach there. Long answer, probably the most complicated aspect of developing the regulations.
Oh, you have a quick thank you on that. And my apologies, it was ecotones. I didn't realize that terminology. It's the first time I've seen that one. Okay, any other questions, folks? Kind of nearing the hour. All right, thanks so much for your time. I'll send out those questions to the member list. Thanks so much, John. It's, I think, helpful for us as some of us get into the post-COVID engagement on new plans and things like that. So.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. We appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for entertaining our questions. And any further thoughts or questions or points you'd like us to consider, as I said, my contact information is on the last page there. So we would really appreciate hearing from you. Don't stand on ceremony. Just whenever you have a thought. These conversations are very helpful for us as we fine tune our approach, and we really appreciate the opportunity to talk to LPANs today.
Great. Thanks so much. Take care, everybody.